Welcome back to the podcast.
We have a great show for you today.
Welcome to the debate. Today we're examining the psychological mechanisms of second language production.
Specifically, we're looking at the tension between overcoming communication anxiety and, well, maintaining your linguistic complexity.
Right. We're really digging into this phenomenon where adult language learners find themselves mentally fluent, but, verbally paralyzed. It's this frustrating state where the brain is packed with complex sentences, but the mouth remains strictly on mute. I argue that the only way to break this paralysis is by aggressively lowering what linguists call the affective filter, basically bypassing anxiety by deliberately using simplified, even radically imperfect communication.
And I contend that this simple is better approach is actually a trap. Aggressively dumbing down your output merely to bypass your anxiety is a dangerous game. It risks sacrificing the nuance, the identity, and the intellectual fidelity that mature adult speakers really strive to express.
Well, let's start by looking at the actual neurobiology of what researchers diagnose as the noisy brain, because we need to understand why that system crash happens in the first place.
Right, the system crash.
Yeah. Picture your brain as a high-end laptop. You've got the latest processor, terabytes of storage, and you're running a highly complex algorithm. The data is all there, meticulously organized in your hard drive. But the very second you press the print command to share those results, a background security program suddenly spikes. It hogs 99% of your system's RAM. The screen freezes, the cursor turns into that little spinning wheel of death.
Oh, yeah. And the system completely shuts down. It's a total, catastrophic failure of the output mechanism.
Exactly.
And the tragic part is, it's not because the data was missing. Your hard drive is completely fine. The internal processor wasn't flawed. It is entirely a failure of transmission.
Spot on. And if you're listening right now, there is a very good chance you've experienced that exact system failure. You're sitting in a meeting, or maybe at a cafe in a foreign country. You have the perfect articulate point to make in a second language.
But the words just vanish.
Right. The grammar is lined up in your head, but the moment you open your mouth, your working memory just crashes. And for the vast majority of adult learners, the primary obstacle isn't a cognitive deficit. You aren't lacking the internal grammar rules.
You probably have the vocabulary stored somewhere in there.
Exactly. The barrier is affective. It's an emotional wall, and it's usually born from some past social trauma. Think about the classic scenario. A student in a classroom makes a minor pronunciation error, and a strict teacher corrects them in a really cold, unforgiving tone.
Right. Or worse, the entire class laughs at them. A totally formative public humiliation.
Precisely. And that single moment it can linger in a person's neurology for decades. It creates this internal alarm system. The brain's amygdala, the fear center, essentially acts as that strict, punitive teacher. So when you go to speak Spanish or French, your amygdala whispers that a mistake isn't just a language error. It is a profound threat to your social survival.
Yes!
So what happens physically? The amygdala triggers a stress response, flooding your system with cortisol. And that stress hormone literally impairs your prefrontal cortex, which is where your working memory lives. The vocabulary is physically blocked from retrieval.
Your RAM is hijacked by fear.
Exactly. Therefore, I argue that the only viable path to functional fluency is to deliberately bypass that perfectionism. The learner has to adopt what I call an under-construction mindset. You have to abandon the agonizing wait for the perfect bus, that flawless, grammatically pristine sentence that, never actually arrives.
Okay, but
By utilizing practical tools like pre-memorized, ready phrases and drastically simplified syntax, learners can bypass the brain's self-censorship and actually initiate the physical motor function of speech.
look, I absolutely acknowledge the paralyzing effect of linguistic anxiety. The physiological response to perceived social judgment, that cortisol flood you just described, is very real and it's profoundly limiting. But I'm sorry, I just don't buy that the remedy is radical linguistic reduction.
Why not, if it gets you speaking?
Because the approach you're advocating suggests a strategy where an adult learner takes a complex, professional thought, something like, I have always been interested in improving my communication skills, and deliberately reduces it down to the elementary utterance, I want to speak better.
Well, sure, but it gets the point across.
But I find this to be an intellectually reductive compromise. Yes, I want to speak better might temporarily relieve the pressure on your working memory, but it fundamentally limits your ability to represent your true adult cognitive capacity.
I mean, temporary relief is better than totally freezing up, isn't it?
Relying on memorized, generic, reaction words and rudimentary grammar might successfully get you through a fleeting interaction, sure, but it strips you of your nuance. The internal struggle you describe, this so-called noise in the brain, is not merely a psychological defect to be bypassed.
Feels like a defect when you're the one freezing up.
But that friction is the necessary, rigorous cognitive work required to achieve true, sophisticated language mastery. When you teach an adult to speak like a child just to soothe their anxiety, you are sacrificing their intellectual identity.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on what that noise actually represents. You're framing this internal friction as rigorous academic work. You're making it sound like the learner is sitting in a quiet library, deeply pondering the beauty of syntax.
It is a mental process.
But let's look at the reality of the mind as a crowded room. When a learner is put on the spot, say, their name is suddenly called in a video conference with native speakers, their brain isn't peacefully calculating linguistic variables. Every entity in that room is shouting at the exact same time.
Well, they're searching for the right words.
They're overwhelmed. You have grammar rules screaming about verb conjugation, vocabulary options fighting for attention, and most loudly, you have fear sounding a siren. It is sheer cognitive overload. You cannot engage in rigorous intellectual work when your neurological Wi-Fi has been turned off by an anxiety response.
I understand the pressure, but
The prefrontal cortex is offline. Insisting that a learner do the rigorous cognitive work in that moment is like asking someone to solve a calculus problem while a fire alarm is blaring in their ear.
That's a vivid image, but are we entirely sure we aren't being too quick to pathologize this internal processing as mere fear? Let me jump in with a different scenario.
Go for it.
Imagine a learner sitting at a family dinner party. The guests are speaking the target language. The learner understands everything being said, and they have a deeply insightful, nuanced comment to add to the political discussion happening at the table.
Okay.
They sit there in silence, carefully polishing the sentence in their mind, ensuring the syntax is correct, making sure the vocabulary perfectly matches their adult intellect. And by the time the sentence is ready, the conversation has moved on.
Which is a complete tragedy of misconnection. They spent so much time polishing that they completely missed the chance to participate.
But is it a tragedy or is it practice? You call it a failure of courage, a system crash resulting from an internalized strict teacher. I ask, have you considered that this pausing, this silent polishing, is simply the necessary mental heavy lifting required to formulate mature concepts in a non-native framework?
I think that's a very generous interpretation of freezing up.
The learner at that dinner party is demonstrating a high standard for their own output. They want to contribute something of value, correctly. Pathologizing that desire for precision as a toxic, fear-based perfectionism completely dismisses the very real, very difficult cognitive leap required to map adult thoughts onto newly acquired grammar. They aren't frozen in terror, they're working.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The desire for precision is admirable in a vacuum, but language does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in time. It exists in the messy, rapid-fire reality of human connection.
True. Conversations move fast.
Exactly. If you're working so hard on a sentence that the topic changes before you can open your mouth, your high standards have actively prevented communication. Let's look at the efficacy of linguistic reduction through a very practical, low-stakes example. Going to a bakery.
All right, the bakery.
A language learner has practiced a perfectly constructed sentence outside the shop. "Hello, could I please have a slice of that chocolate cake?" They walk in, but suddenly the baker turns to them, speaks rapidly, maybe asks a completely unexpected question.
And the cortisol hits?
The brain unplugs. Now, instead of standing there in silent, rigorous cognitive processing trying to perfectly conjugate the verb while a line of angry customers forms behind them, they point at the glass and say, hi, I cake this, please."
Right. An utterance that completely violates the syntactic rules they just spent 3 hours studying the night before.
Yes, it's grammatically horrific. And yet, what happens? They walk out of the bakery with the chocolate cake. The baker smiled, the transaction was completed, and the communicative goal was achieved.
Well, sure, they got the cake.
Because simple and spoken is always better than perfect and silent. When we champion the use of basic, ready phrases or simplified grammar to navigate daily life, we're championing action over paralysis. If the learner had stood there silently polishing their grammar to meet your standard of intellectual fidelity, they would have walked out empty-handed.
Maybe, but
And worse, they would have compounded their internal sense of failure. The fear wins.
look, I grant you the cake. The transaction was successful, and in a bakery, that's fine. But I want to introduce a concept here that I think gets entirely lost in this pursuit of pure transactional efficiency. Let's call it intellectual mutism.
Intellectual mutism?
Yes. You successfully acquire the pastry, but you have surrendered your intellectual identity in the process.
Oh, come on. How does buying a piece of cake with broken grammar strip a person of their intellectual identity? We're talking about dessert, not a philosophical treatise.
Because the bakery is a benign example. The stakes are low. Let's elevate this simple is better philosophy to where it actually hurts. The workplace or deep interpersonal relationships.
Okay, let's hear it.
We see frameworks out there actively encouraging learners to take a nuanced expression like, recently I've been feeling overwhelmed with my studies, and swap it for the rudimentary phrase, study is hard these days.
Do you see the profound loss of meaning there? Feeling overwhelmed communicates an internal emotional state. It expresses vulnerability. It signals to the listener that your personal capacity is being breached. Study is hard, on the other hand, is a generic, almost infantile observation about the external world. It's what a fourth grader says.
I feel like you're being a bit harsh on the fourth grader. And the learner.
But by intentionally training yourself to actively avoid complex articulation, aren't you trapping the learner in a perpetual state of linguistic infancy? You are teaching them that it is acceptable to be a lesser version of themselves, just to avoid the discomfort of a brain cramp.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you're assuming this reduction is a permanent destination. It is not. It's a transitional bridge. It's scaffolding.
A bridge to where, if they never practice the complex sentences?
You cannot run before you can walk. The adult learner is overwhelmed precisely because they are trying to map a highly sophisticated adult conceptual framework onto a linguistic infrastructure that is still in its infancy. Their ideas are skyscrapers, but their vocabulary is made of Legos.
Right, but
Let me just finish. When they use simplified phrases or what we call reaction words, small, prepackaged phrases like, "Oh really, that's nice," or "I get you, that's difficult," they are participating in the rhythm of conversation. They are staying in the game.
are they really in the game, or are they just pressing a button that plays a pre-recorded sound so the native speaker doesn't realize they've disconnected?
They are buying their brain critical seconds. When someone says, "Oh wow, that's so interesting," it takes 0 RAM to process. It's automatic. And while their mouth is saying that, their brain is buying a 2-second window to actually find the next vocabulary word without the crushing, terrifying weight of dead silence.
I suppose that's one way to look at it.
More importantly, this is where the under construction framework becomes so vital. When an adult formally accepts that their language is a work in progress, they lower the affective filter. They quiet that harsh inner critic. They give themselves permission to lay the foundation without needing the building to look perfect on day one.
Right, but foundation building requires practice.
Trusted friend who won't judge you. You literally just talk to a mirror. You safely build the physical, mechanical habit of speech without the threat of a strict teacher judging your intellect.
Okay, I will concede the utility of the mirror exercise for purely mechanical practice. Getting the muscles of the mouth accustomed to the phonetics of a new language is essential, and doing it alone removes the social threat.
See? It works.
But here's where your bridge analogy breaks down for me. Conversational reality is inherently high pressure. It is dynamic, it is unpredictable, and it requires deep, spontaneous cognitive engagement. You cannot train for a marathon solely by walking in your living room.
No, but you have to walk before you run.
I question whether isolating oneself in these safe modes adequately prepares a speaker for the actual arena.
It builds the baseline confidence required to step into the arena. If you don't practice in the mirror, you never even walk out the front door.
Or it provides a very dangerous false sense of progress. Let's think about those generic reaction words again. If you train yourself month after month to respond to a colleague's complex story with a memorized, "No way, that's difficult," you are masking an underlying deficit in your language mastery.
I wouldn't call it masking, it's coping.
You aren't actually communicating. You're learning how to successfully perform the appearance of comprehension. It's a performative shortcut. And human nature dictates that we gravitate toward what is easy. The danger is that the learner gets comfortable on that bridge.
You think they just stay there forever?
They rely on the ready phrases, they rely on the simplest syntax, and they never actually return to the rigorous work of figuring out how to express that they are deeply overwhelmed, rather than just stating that study is hard.
Well,
True linguistic construction, the kind that allows you to be your full adult self in a new language, requires the friction of wrestling with the complex sentence. You have to endure the discomfort of not knowing the word, of pausing, of searching for it in real time. If you constantly take the shortcut to bypass the anxiety, the bridge just becomes a parking lot.
But if wrestling with the complex sentence results in absolutely zero output because the learner is too terrified to open their mouth, then no construction is happening at all. The building materials are just sitting on an empty lot gathering dust.
So we just settle for the Legos.
we have to look at the reality of human behavior. The fundamental bottleneck to human connection in a second language isn't a lack of vocabulary. It isn't a lack of desire to be intellectually understood. It is the paralysis of perfectionism.
I agree that perfectionism is a barrier.
Right. So empowering learners to accept their language as a work under construction is the most pragmatic approach we have. When you permit yourself to speak imperfectly, you turn abstract silent knowledge into real-world communication. Over time, that continuous imperfect action naturally builds the capacity for the very nuance you are advocating for.
You think it naturally evolves?
Absolutely. The more you speak, the less the amygdala fires. The less the amygdala fires, the more working memory you have available. And the more working memory you have, the more complex your sentences naturally become. It's a biological feedback loop.
I agree that the fear of judgment is a deeply ingrained barrier, and overcoming that initial spike of cortisol is paramount. We are aligned on the biology of the problem.
Good, we're on the same page there.
However, we must remain incredibly wary of pedagogical frameworks that systematically train adults to reduce their sophisticated thoughts to beginner-level output as a primary long-term strategy. True fluency, which is the ultimate goal we should be striving for, requires conquering that fear without compromising the intellectual complexity of the message.
It's a high bar, though.
It is, but we cannot ask mature, intelligent speakers to permanently check their adult cognition at the door just to keep a conversation moving. We have to teach them to sit with the friction. We have to teach them that the momentary silence, the pause while you search for the exact right word, is not a failure. It is the sound of a sophisticated mind at work. We need to encourage them to endure that discomfort and to do the hard, necessary work of building the perfect sentence.
Well, it seems we are navigating a very delicate balance here. There is a distinct, undeniable tension between the immediate psychological relief of simplified speech, getting the words out and keeping the cortisol low, and the long-term cognitive demands of linguistic precision.
Absolutely. At its core, it really comes down to how we negotiate our identity and our competence when we cross linguistic divides.
Yeah.
Every learner has to ask themselves a difficult question. Do I prioritize being heard at any cost, even if what is heard is a vastly diminished, infantile version of my true self? Or do I fiercely protect my intellectual fidelity, even if it means occasionally enduring the agonizing silence of that crowded, noisy room in my brain?
It certainly invites all of us to critically examine our own internal dialogues and to question the strict, punitive teachers we carry in our minds.
Exactly.
Which brings us right back to that unplugged supercomputer in a darkened room.
We have to decide for ourselves whether it is better to boot up in safe mode and run a simpler program just to get the screen back on, or to sit in the dark, painstakingly trying to rebuild the motherboard so that one day the full, magnificent complexity of our data can finally be transmitted.
It's a question of balance, of timing, and of psychological readiness that every language learner must ultimately determine for their own journey.
Indeed, there is certainly much more to explore regarding how we map our true selves onto a completely new vocabulary, and how much of our identity we're willing to risk in the process.
Definitely.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and we will catch you next time.